Conference. For this session, I'm incredibly excited to introduce Professor David Brommel from the School of Government at Victoria University of Wellington. Professor Brommel will be discussing the topic of misinformation, disinformation, and the urge to censor. Please join me in welcoming Professor Brommel for today's talk.
Well, thank you, and greetings from New Zealand. I'm glad to have the opportunity to share some reflections on misinformation, disinformation, and the urge to censor. I'll run through my presentation and take questions at the end. When bad things happen, two common reactions are that the government should have prevented it and there should be a law against it. We saw this after a terrorist attack on two mosques in my home city of Christchurch on March the 15th, 2019. Predictably, New Zealand's government responded by announcing inquiries and promising to review, amend, or enact laws. The immediate focus was on gun laws, regulation of hate speech, and because it was the first time a terrorist attack had been live streamed on social media, concern that online service providers had been doing too little too late to moderate terrorist and violent extremist content on the internet. 2 months to the day after the attack, Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern and French President Emmanuel Macron initiated the Christchurch call to eliminate terrorist and violent extremist content online. My reaction to this was somewhat skeptical. Is the goal of elimination practically feasible? And to what extent do we want governments controlling the internet and our exercise of the right to freedom of opinion and expression? A research fellowship at the Center for Advanced Internet Studies in Bochum, Germany, from October 2020 was an opportunity for me to step back and think this through. On returning home to New Zealand in April 2021, I wrote up my research and thinking about this in a book published by Springer, Regulating Free Speech in a Digital Age, Hate, Harm, and the Limits of Censorship. Now, of course, the context in which I was thinking this through was the COVID-19 pandemic, during which the New Zealand government's concerns about internet regulation, terrorism, and hate speech broadened to include misinformation, disinformation, and media content regulation. Particularly in the early stages of the pandemic, governments and their advisors were dealing with significant uncertainty. Conflicting information and advice circulating on the internet added to the confusion and fueled elite panic about misinformation and disinformation. In an interview in March 2020, Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern acknowledged that our understanding of COVID-19 was evolving rapidly and that rumors were circulating on social media. She committed to sharing the most up-to-date information daily and on the Ministry of Health's website, urging trust in government as the source of that information. She went on to say, "We will continue to be your single source of truth. We'll provide information frequently. We will share everything we can. Everything else you see, a grain of salt." Well, it was extraordinary for the Prime Minister of a democratic state to claim to be the single source of truth, but Ardern stood by her comment when questioned about it in the House. And she went on to portray an overconfidence in science for the political management of the pandemic and a too-ready conviction that anyone who disagrees with the government must have been infected with mis or disinformation. An urge to control the flow of information masquerading as a politics of kindness, tended towards authoritarianism and a draconian curtailing of civil liberties. This played out in an extended border closure, lockdowns, mask and vaccine mandates, and disdain for protesters who set up camp outside the Parliament in February 2022 and were forcibly evicted by police on March the 2nd. On February the 16th, 2022, then Government Minister and Deputy Leader of the House, Michael Wood, spoke in the House about the anti-mandate protest. Out the front of this place, there are people who I think we all feel for. There are some people who are confused. There are some people who are scared. There are some people who have been manipulated by an avalanche of misinformation. But underneath all that, there is a river of filth. The Department of the Prime Minister and Cabinet has led the government's response to mis and disinformation and defines these terms on its website. But what's missing from definitions like these is acknowledgement that information may be false or misleading, but not unlawful. The level of actual risk can range from negligible to significant, and even if people do communicate manifestly false but lawful information, this does not justify the state restricting their freedom of opinion and expression. Let's remember too that false and misleading information also comes from governments and politicians who want coercive powers to define what is true and what is false, to act as the single source of truth. A briefing to the Prime Minister in December 2020 recommended that DPMC continue to lead the government's work on misinformation with an interagency coordination group and a ministerial group of 6 ministers representing 9 portfolios in consultation with 3 additional ministers. A draft strategic framework for strengthening New Zealand's resilience to mis and disinformation was appended to the briefing. The government's first national security long-term insights briefing was developed during 2022 and published in March 2023. It identified mis and disinformation as a major concern for national security. The briefing stated, the spread of disinformation and misinformation affects our ability to meet challenges such as COVID-19 as a whole country based on a shared understanding of evidence. We are worried that this challenge will continue and accelerate into the future. In presenting New Zealand's national statement to the UN General Assembly in September 2022, Ardern described mis and disinformation online as weapons of war, perpetuating an old and deeply misleading conflation of speech and violence, words and weapons. It will take time before historians can arrive at a balanced assessment of Jacinda Ardern's leadership and the impact on society and the economy of New Zealand's 6th Labour government. The public broadly endorsed the Labour-led government's initial response to COVID-19, and in the 2020 general election, rewarded Labour with 50% of the party vote and 65 seats, enough for a majority government, and the first time a party had won enough seats to govern alone since the introduction of mixed member proportional representation in 1996. By late October 2022, however, Jacinda mania had largely burnt itself out. Reasons for this included the arrival in New Zealand of the Delta and then Omicron variants of COVID-19, hard lockdowns, particularly in Auckland, where 1/3 of the population lives, discontent with the border closure and the government's operation of managed isolation, poor fiscal discipline and incompetent program delivery, and pushback on the government's imposition of a revisionist interpretation of the Treaty of Waitangi in co-governance with Māori of public services. Ardern herself had become New Zealand's most polarising political leader since Robert Muldoon, Prime Minister from 1975 to 84. She resigned as Prime Minister in January 2023, but it was not enough to save the Labour Party's fortunes. In the general election held in October 2023, Labour won only 27% of the party vote and 34 seats, a 23% swing against the government. In November 2023, the National, ACT and New Zealand First parties formed a centre-right coalition government. Coalition agreements included commitments to equal citizenship, protection of freedom of speech by ruling out the introduction of hate speech legislation and stopping the Law Commission's work on it, and the promise of a wide-ranging and independent inquiry into how the COVID-19 pandemic was handled in New Zealand. It's not yet clear whether the new government will continue, shut down, or refocus the work led by DPMC on mis and disinformation. Now, based on my reading and thinking about these things, my advice to our new government would run along these lines. Pay more than lip service to a free, open, and secure internet, and to freedom of opinion and expression, freedom of association, and freedom of the press. Yes, of course, false and misleading information thrives online and can lead to real-world harms, but its share of overall online content is modest. Do not panic and rein in the urge to censor. Danish human rights advocate Jacob Machangama has noted that between 2016 and 2022, governments around the globe passed 91 laws to target false or misleading information, leading to the arrest of journalists and others who questioned official government policies. In international human rights law, yes, freedom of speech is a qualified right, but the bar is set high. States may justifiably prohibit public communication that intends or is imminently likely to incite acts of hostility, discrimination, and violence. But for all the rest, censorship, even of speech that is lawful but awful, or false and misleading, does more harm than good, and it simply does not work. In a special message to the Congress on the internal security of the United States in August 1950, President Harry Truman cautioned against a wave of hysteria about communism infiltrating the US. He urged a moderate and measured approach that does not undermine civil liberties, saying, once the government is committed to the principle of silencing the voice of opposition, it has only one way to go, and that is down the path of increasingly repressive measures until it becomes a source of terror to all its citizens and creates a country where everyone lives in fear. There is an alternative to elite panic about mis and disinformation. It involves reinvigorating the theory and practice of liberal democracy. I offer 5 strategies in closing. First, acknowledge pluralism and accept that people genuinely do differ in what we think, believe, and value. In a best case scenario, democratic governments that attempt to compel right thinking or right living are on course to electoral defeat. And in a worst case scenario, they are on course to authoritarianism. Learning to live well with difference is difficult but necessary and essential in a functioning democracy. Secondly, practice and institutionalize a culture of live and let live. Because we think, believe, and value different things, conflict between us is inevitable. We manage this politically, institutionally, under the rule of law, without resorting to violence or inciting others to violence. The price we pay for freedom from violence is that we have to tolerate what we dislike in one another's ideas, beliefs, values, practices, and ways of life. Thirdly, desist from labeling criticism, disagreement, and dissent as mis or disinformation. Take criticism on the chin and remember that especially when we are making decisions in contexts of uncertainty, we won't always get it right and we will make mistakes. Fourthly, nurture and model a culture of free speech and open debate. Answer false or misleading information with accurate information and reasoned argument. Communicate rapidly, accurately, positively, and honestly. And finally, exposing, shaming, and ridiculing opponents does not work and will only increase polarization. Exercise and enable effective counter-speech that calls people in instead of calling them out. Be curious and interested in why people disagree. These are the strategies I offer as alternatives to a lead panic about mis and disinformation and the urge to censor. Acknowledge pluralism, practice an institutionalized toleration, desist from labeling criticism, disagreement, and dissent as mis or disinformation, nurture and model a culture of free speech and open debate, and exercise and enable counter-speech. Thank you for listening. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Professor Brommel, and thank you for zooming in from all the way across the world. We really appreciate it. So now we'll be taking any questions from the room or our online audience. So I'll be passing the mic around, but it looks like we have a question, so I'll run it over.
Thank you very much. This is Hasnan Bukhari from University of Erfurt in Germany. And also thank you for your really candid thoughts, may I say, on the issue of disinformation and misinformation, particularly in the times when it's like hell broke loose kind of a situation. A couple of thoughts, and please help me understand a few things here. Certain insights that I think would help. Number one, when it comes to internet, a product of a Cold War, period, I have a feeling, and I don't think I'm alone in that. A number of authors have started to think about that and have been doing this. The kind of a terminology that we are stuck in, national security. You quoted Prime Minister from New Zealand, the war mentality. There is no war. We have a different nature of war. And then a secure internet. All these things, when we look into a perspective of open internet, they fall into A, national security perspective, no debates possible. B, secure internet, securitization perspective, no debates possible, right? Three, we talk about war. I mean, it's been more than 35 years internet has been around. We're still thinking in terms of war. Even cyber warfare has become such a big topic. The war is no longer possible, but the mentality remains the same. Perhaps a couple of insights from that perspective, that how to get out of this mentality, the Cold War mentality that we still inhabit, or perhaps we don't have to come out of it. Maybe we would like to stay in there. That's number one. Number two, You talk about very candidly 5 alternatives, and to borrow your words, elite panic. Is it only an elite panic? That means the elite is perhaps the minority, so the majority does not have to panic, number one. Number two, these 5 alternatives that you provide, on one hand, I would so much would love to also endorse and actually understand that as well. Nevertheless, if we look at the current debate on dis and misinformation, we have a problem that the elite panic says that, hey, we are living in echo chambers. And these echo chambers are causing the majority, not class, but rather a mass. So that's leading to populism and so on and so forth. So on one hand, I would so much would love to endorse these 5, yet I'm a little confused how to address this elite panic. Thank you.
Thank you. Mauricio, I can no longer see the room. Has your computer gone to screensaver?
Can you hear us or can you not see
I
us?
can hear you. I just can't see you.
Yeah, I think the AV team is working on it right now. I think it just went down.
Oh,
But if we
okay.
just want to continue with just audio, my apologies.
Look, thank you very much for that very thoughtful comment. I really struggle with issues around internet governance. It's an incredibly complicated area. I think that's an interesting observation that the internet developed during the Cold War period. There has always been a bit of a tussle between governments and the private sector. The elite panic I'm talking about is it goes to a concern that I've had for some time that, at least in our part of the world, so much of politics and policy making has been captured by a professional managerial elite. And where I've seen this surface most recently internationally is in the Global Risks Report issued this month by the World Economic Forum, which is a great example of elite panic about a tech-enabled Armageddon and an infodemic unleashed by COVID-19. So I kind of want to fall back on the, look, let's just keep calm and carry on. Let's stop and think. We certainly saw an elite panic playing out here when the occupation of Parliament grounds occurred. And some of the comments that parliamentarians made about the protesters without ever actually going to talk to them. I think you've raised so many fascinating questions in your comment. I'm very grateful for it, and I'll want to come back to the points you've raised and think about them further.
All right. Do we have any other questions from the room?
Hi, thank you very much for your talk. My name is Tyler West, and I'm a PhD candidate from Ireland. And my research looks at the place of user agency in technology regulation. So I think this is a very apt talk. But my question is, I think sometimes the liberal democratic argument for free speech, in the absolutist terms, maybe overlooks the fact that we're not living in a perfect public sphere. It's not as if everybody's, out exchanging their ideas, whether they may be true, false, or whatever, on even terms. I mean, people are being manipulated psychologically. There are obviously echo chambers happening. And these these do have material effects. So I think in some ways when we talk about a very kind of live and let live mentality, think what you want, say what you want, which in theory is fantastic. In reality, people aren't really thinking what they want or expressing what they want because they're being manipulated, and that's causing effects society-wide. So personally, I see this as a problem. I would agree with your argument that censorship doesn't work, but I also think that it's such a problem. Society does require a level of ontological shared understanding at some level. So I'm just wondering whether you think anything should be done about this, whether you think it's a problem, or whether you think that the live and let live mentality still holds in an age where people can be extremely manipulated online.
Thank you for your question. It lets me clarify first that I am not a free speech absolutist or a free speech purist. I did mention briefly in my presentation that in international human rights law, the right to freedom of speech is a qualified right. And states can justifiably prohibit the incitement of acts of hostility, discrimination, and violence. So there are limits to the exercise of free speech. But in terms of the point you raise about, yes, there is false and misleading information circulating on the internet, and some of it does real harm. So the question is, who do you trust to regulate it? Do you trust governments across the globe to regulate the internet? In the history of the internet, we've always balked at that one. It's too tempting for a government to use it just to suppress opposition. Do we trust the private sector and the big tech companies to regulate the internet? Well, that's that whole phenomenon of surveillance capitalism. They're in it to make money, and they design the algorithms that that attract an audience and allow them to monetize the time that we spend on the internet. I think the way forward has to lie through a multi-stakeholder approach to internet governance that involves tech companies, governments, the community and voluntary sector, the NGOs, and private citizens and users of services, to all in their own way contribute to at least minimizing the nasties on the internet. But that's going to be a complex process, and as someone who worked for nearly 20 years in government, I do not have the confidence that either the governments are competent to deal with this, or that it would be wise to give them the power to do so. So it's I'm not saying that free speech is an absolute right. I'm just asking the question, if we want to restrict the exercise of freedom of opinion and expression, what would be the kind of rules, and who would be the rule makers that we would trust to do that in a responsible manner?
Terrific. I think we have time for maybe one more question, if that's all right with the professor. We could fit one more in if anyone has one. All right. Any questions online? All right, well, thank you so much. And have a great rest of your day. We appreciate you zooming in. Round of applause. Thank you.
Great, thank you.